Hi everyone. This series of videos will take you through lesson 8B in our new packet, which is applying what we learned in the previous lesson, 8A, about negative and zero exponents. This lesson is really meant to give you more algebraic practice, so it's less about the concept of looking at a sequence and the initial value and the multiplier and the table, and more about just focusing on the nitty-gritty. Like, what does a zero exponent do? What does a negative exponent do? And how can you solve problems that have negative and zero exponents? So essentially, the key takeaway messages that you should know from the previous lesson are two really main ideas. Namely that anything to the power of 0 is 1. And I'm using my scratch paper from the previous video to recap this note. So if you need to, go back to the playlist from week 33 Monday and recap some of those ideas if it's been some time since you really digested them. But key rule number 1 was that anything to the power of 0 is mathematically equivalent to just a 1, so a single substitution. And the other key rule that we took away from that series of videos was that if you have a negative power, that you really had two steps to kind of follow. And I'll just quickly write those two steps. If you have a negative power, we did what we call flip the base was the multiplier, and make the power positive. So hopefully, if you remember those two key rules, you'll be able to pretty quickly blast through question number 1 using those two rules plus any additional rules of exponents that you already know. For example, in number 1, letter A, 6 times 2 to the 0 clearly has a 0 power, so I'll apply that rule that anything to the power of 0 is 1. Now I'll just remember here, the 6 is not being raised to the power of 0, just the 2 is. So 2 to the power of 0 is 1. That's a substitution I'm allowed to make. But the 6 is still multiplying that 1. So 6 times 1 would give me 6. It's important to note that just because there's a 0 power doesn't mean the whole answer is 1. It just means whatever the base is that's being raised to the 0 power can be substituted with a 1 instead. The other rule comes up in something like question letter B, 4 to the negative power, or 4 to the power of negative 2. That clearly has a negative power, so we can use the two rules that we discussed in the previous lesson. We can flip the base. The base is 4. Its reciprocal becomes 1/4, and it makes the power positive, so negative 2 becomes positive 2, and then that becomes a basic multiplication question. 1/4 squared is just 1/4 times 1/4 becomes 1/16. So the rest of these questions are basically just asking you to incorporate those rules plus whatever rules of exponents you already know. So try not to use a calculator if you can. Try to focus on what you know about exponents so that you can tap into that part of your brain, especially if it's been a while since you've done exponent problems. And see if you can do really two things between now and the time you start the next video. First, finish number 1. And of course, check your answers. Should be an implied part of finishing number 1 is checking your answers. And then try to do numbers 2 through 6. Try to generalize in your own words the rules of exponents that you know. I've already used my words to help you figure out something you can write for a 0 exponent. Anything to the power of 0 is 1. You can use my words for that. I've also tried to generalize what negative exponents do. They flip the base and make the power positive. So again, you can use my words there for number 3. But see if you can try to kind of suss out some words for the rest of these questions from 4 through 6. What happens when you raise an exponential, like letter C, 2 to the power of 3, to another exponent? Another power of 2. So this is kind of like saying, generally speaking, what rule of exponents might you have learned that could help you with a problem like that? In number 5, it says, generally speaking, what happens when you multiply two exponential expressions with common bases? Well, that's letter D up here. That's like saying 2 and 2, those are common bases. They both have the same thing. What happens when you multiply 2 to the negative third times 2 squared? What happens to the powers? What happens in general? See if you remember or can figure out what's going on with those exponents. Maybe there was a rule you learned in the past there. And in question number 6, it says, what happens when you divide two exponential expressions with common bases? Maybe you remember something about letter E that could help. So it's not really that I was ever going to teach these rules of exponents. These are rules of exponents that usually come from Algebra 1 or maybe even middle school. This is just asking you, how would you do it? based on your past experience, based on your understanding of exponents, how do you understand questions C, D, and E? So put these in your own words. You don't have to put them in my words because I don't have such words for these. These are not things that I personally have taught you nor will teach you necessarily. Although, to be fair, if it's something you don't know, like if it's something where you're thinking, oh, Herbert, my Algebra 1 teacher never taught that, or I don't remember learning this, or I think I learned it, but I don't remember any rules, so I need a quick refresher. Then just reach out and ask. Send me an email or pop into the Zoom office hours and have me go over this. But because we're trying to tap into our own foundations here, I'm going to ask you not to think about these C, D, and E as new problems. Think of them as problems you've already done and ask yourself, how would I do it? With my current amount of information, how would I figure this out? Because it's that entrepreneurial spirit that you'll take whatever ideas you have and forge forward without somebody guiding you, that's kind of what we're going to try to use the most in this chapter, building on those instincts we already have, rather than preloading ourselves with a bunch of rules that we just have to follow. So between now and the next video, try to finish 1 through 6, use the answer key, check your answers, make sure everything makes sense, and of course, if there's a question or if you hit a stopping point, make sure that you take the time to reach out and ask somebody, whether it's me or a classmate or a friend from another class, whatever. Reach out and ask somebody if you need to help boost some of your areas of weakness before you build on them any further.